Welcome to For the Love of Weather podcast. This is the podcast where we chat about the weather and climate and how it can impact our daily lives. I'm Gemma.
Hello, and I'm Aisling. We are both meteorologists, we're both weather presenters, and we're both terribly curious about the weather and climate. And we always hope that you leave an episode just learning and loving a little bit more about the weather and climate. And today's very special episode is coming from Kew Gardens, and we have got to meet some incredible guests, which we will introduce you to over the next half hour or so.
All about the new carbon garden that is at Kew Gardens.
So I'm Dr. Justin Moat. I'm a senior research leader in spatial analysts here at Kew. We spend our time measuring landscapes and working out what's going on with plants in that landscape. And I'm here because this is the carbon garden. It's a kind of, for us, it's a mixture of horticulture and science. And we did a lot of the work actually measuring how much carbon there is within the gardens and within the trees around the gardens.
So what's LiDAR? What has it got to do with here? Tell us everything.
Oh, so LiDAR's a technology. It's to some degree uses a very simple technique of actually measuring angle and distance, but it uses a laser beam that shoots out millions and millions of laser beams in a whole sphere around the instrument. And what it allows us to do is measure the landscape in really high resolution in 3D, and that's fantastically useful for trees. Trees are all gnarly, different shapes, and trying to actually measure how much carbon is in a tree is very difficult. The only real way of doing it is chopping it down and weighing it. We don't want to do that. So actually by measuring the really 3D change in the tree, we can actually work out how much carbon it is and where the carbon is actually sitting within that tree. And then if we do that yearly, we can actually see the changes in the carbon in that tree.
And where do trees store the majority of their carbon? Does it depend on the tree species or?
Most trees are pretty similar. So nearly all of your carbon is sitting in that biomass, the heavy bit, the trunk. So the trunk is where you've got most of it. But the issue we've got here is that if your trees are nice and straight poles, that's relatively easy to measure. But most trees in nature have branches that will pop out on one side or beam in a different direction. And that kind of throws up what we call our traditional allometric equations, where we measure a tree's girth, like measuring our waist. And from that, you can extrapolate how much carbon is in a tree. But as the tree gets older, puts on lots of different lumps and bumps, those equations start to fall apart. So the only way of really measuring it is by using LiDAR without destroying the tree. And what's useful of LiDAR is we can actually measure a whole patch of forest and take that apart virtually in the computer, stack all the trees by a biomass or species, start taking the trees themselves apart as well, bits of the branches, look at the angles of those branches, which way the leaves are sitting on those branches. So it's a great diagnostic tool, basically used in 3D technology, used in 3D films, on cars, etc., but we're repurposing it for nature.
Tell us about that. How is that used here in creating this garden?
So what we wanted to do was to sort of give some idea to the public how much carbon sits in this tree, and that's quite difficult to do. So we actually took one of our bigger trees, the Turner oak, which is this big green one behind us. It's one of our largest trees at Kew. It's actually quite unusual in the fact that because it's been pampered and actually hasn't had much grazing, it has lots and lots of branches coming out of the bottom. So we scanned that in with my team. They scanned in sort of 4 or 5 really large scans around that, millions and millions of points. It produces a beautiful 3D tree. And then we put that into the computer and break it down into cylinders, into logs, and essentially weigh all those logs virtually. And it gives us hopefully a very precise information about how much carbon is sitting in that tree. So that big tree there is about 25 tons. CO2 equivalent will be around 90 tons of CO2 equivalent. That would get us around the world about 10 times. So pretty phenomenal for just one tree.
That's a stunning doing. How did you work backwards from that? So I thought a tree was 9 tons of carbon.
25 tons of carbon.
But this one has.
So that a normal tree, something like this one here, you're probably talking 5 or 6 tons in that, probably less actually. But that really big one there, it's quite an old tree. Trees will continuously put on carbon, and even as they get older, they actually still keep growing. Actually, like humans, they won't stop after a while, they'll just keep going on for it. Eventually, when they get too old, they will start dropping limbs and hollowing out. They're actually still absorbing more carbon, because the bigger they get, more carbon they'll actually get. So the curve essentially goes like that.
So how much carbon do you think is stored in this carbon garden, or how much will be stored? What's the projected, storage?
So because we put this garden in, we've actually been very careful to measure how much carbon is in the garden itself, and also how much we're releasing by the actual process of putting the garden in itself. So there are things like exposing soil. So if you expose your soil, you're actually releasing quite a lot of CO2 because you're increasing the process of CO2 disappearing from your soils. But also if you're planting trees, hopefully those trees will start growing and absorbing some of that CO2. So we've been very careful to balance how much carbon we've got into the gardens by putting in techniques and materials that use low carbon, but also putting in planting that will absorb in the long term more carbon than hopefully the garden will ever produce.
You had to work quite closely with all of your colleagues. But how was that? It's like, it seems there's so many different specialisms within this.
Well, I think that for us, that for part of my job, I always enjoy working across multiple disciplines. So we have the horticulture staff who know how to grow trees and plants. I know their trees really well. And then we have also the sort of garden management and the guys that are basically putting the buildings up and understanding what materials they're using and trying to influence each other and go, okay, well, maybe can we use X? And sometimes you have these extreme ideas as a scientist and you're like, go, why can't we use this? It's a really low carbon technology. And they're like, because that costs an absolute fortune and we can't afford it. But there is a sort of practical alternative. So there's a lot of recycling in here and a lot of kind of change that we made. So we've tried to expose the soil for very short periods. We tried not to heat big holes in the ground, which would then release too much carbon at the same time as well. And it's worth realizing that whilst we've got big trees, huge amounts of carbon sitting in that, below our feet actually is where most carbon sits. It's that interaction between the trees and the species of fungi that are below ground. They're actually pumping lots of carbon into our soils. So better soils will give us more carbon storage. So under our feet here, we're probably talking about 8 kilograms. Doesn't feel like a massive amount. You think a bag of charcoal, that'd actually be a really big bag of charcoal. And then think of that across the whole of Kew. You've actually got a huge amount sitting in your soils.
Red, but you mentioned something about recycling in the garden. What was recycled? I'm imagining, plastic bottles and all that. How do you recycle in a garden?
Well, we're really lucky here at Kew because we have a lot of resources and materials in here. So the simplest things is to look at what we've already got. So for instance, a lot of stone we've moved in here has either come from other gardens within other patches within Kew, or has been stuck at the back of a building for a long time, a historic, maybe 100 years old. But also things like the paving and the pebbles and materials we've got in there, that's for it to be sold with building material. So we're often using that to work out, one, can we recycle it? And two, can we actually reduce our carbon footprint?
So one of the things that myself and Gemma often talk about on our podcast is what can I do? So it's often a very overwhelming thought, what can I do to help? So what can I take from this garden? What can I take home with me?
I think from if you look at the gardens, we've done a lot of sort of work trying to work out which species are going to survive into the future. I think that kind of simple aspect of dealing with which plants we can put in our gardens are actually survivors rather than things we're going to have to water or put a lot of nutrition in to actually keep them going. I think other things, very simple things, is like preserving small amounts of dead wood. If something dies and it's a tree that's fallen over or been removed, leaving that's actually going to be a lot better for one, carbon, you're storing the carbon for a bit, but also for diversity and the species that will live in there. There's a big LiDAR unit coming in. To see it, you're more than welcome to. So these are the guys who do the real work. I just claim all credit for it.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah. So we have a whole suite of scientific equipment we use for our surveys. These guys have been demonstrating elsewhere. We have LiDAR unit here, drones, fixed wing drones, multispectral drones, all of the satellite stuff that we'd use for satellite imagery we have on drones as well. Well timed, those guys were walking past.
Can you tell me your name and what you do and why you're standing beside this? I don't know. Does it look like R2-D2 or something?
A little bit, yeah. Quite right. Airport security, they look very suspicious at this thing. So my name is Phil Wilkes. I'm research leader on the Nature Unlocked program, which is based at Wakehurst. My background is in remote sensing, so viewing in particular around forests, so viewing forests from airborne, terrestrial or satellite data.
So why is this interesting?
Why is this here? So this is a terrestrial laser scanner, and you can essentially think of this as a 3D camera. What we do with this is scan trees and hedgerows and other vegetation, and we can create really detailed 3D models of those trees. And from those very detailed 3D models, we can very accurately estimate the amount of carbon stored in a tree. So this is sort of a new approach to estimating carbon in trees. So before you would have gone out with a tape measure, just measured, maybe taken one measurement around the diameter of the tree and then used an equation to estimate how much carbon is stored. But this allows you to measure really big trees in very high detail, very accurately. And what this instrument applying this instrument has shown is that, in particular, large trees store a disproportionate amount of carbon in our forests. So, and also they're very variable. So you need to use these kind of instruments to capture that sort of information.
What's your background? So you're a nerdy programmer,
Yeah.
but also tree experts.
Yeah. Well,
Can happen.
I came through an unusual route. Most people that work in remote sensing have a physics background, and they're hardcore scientists. I came from a sort of spatial data background. I was very interested. I was doing something really dull in air quality, and then somebody showed me GIS, and I was like, oh my god, look, you can see it, like the world through a completely different lens. And from that, I learned about remote sensing. I worked for the Victorian state government in Australia, where they were like, do you know what LiDAR data is? And I was like, yeah, no idea what it was. And but that allowed me to sort of really get to grips with LiDAR data and programming, and sort of from there led into a PhD. And then, 10 years later, here I stand.
So we're standing right beside this incredible new carbon garden here at Kew. Why was this important in the creation of this?
Yeah, so we scanned the Turner oak over there, a really unusual tree in many ways. But to estimate the carbon from that tree, there's two things you can do. You can either chop it down and weigh it. Obviously, we don't want to do that. Or you can apply the methods that we have derived here through terrestrial LiDAR scanning. So we scanned that tree last year. Ideally, we scan trees leaf off, but that's evergreen. So we had to just capture it whenever we could. And then we estimated, we took that point cloud and we fitted this sort of a set of cylinders to enclose that point cloud. And from that, we can estimate volume, mass, and carbon. And yeah, that's the only other real way we could have estimated carbon for that tree. We could have gone out with a diameter tape, but it's so unusual that, the estimate would have been wildly off. Yeah.
You take an estimate of the carbon here.
Yeah.
And then you apply it to carbon garden?
Yes, so I think there's some information about how much carbon is stored in that tree. But unfortunately, I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's 25 tons of carbon or biomass.
And 8 kilos below your feet.
Yeah. Yeah, 25 tons of carbon. I mean, yeah, that sounds about right. The other thing you have to consider is that different trees have different wood densities, so how heavy the wood is essentially, and holm oak is a heavier species, so for the sort of unit area, it stores a lot more carbon. Yeah, so 25 tons sounds about right.
So what's next for this LiDAR?
We use it for all sorts of different things. So we use it quite a lot down at Wakehurst. We're estimating the mass of different forest types down there, so we can compare different management strategies, coppice, conifer plantation, or ancient woodlands. And the beauty of this is that we can do it through time. So we come back and measure it again in 5 years, and we can see how that ecosystem has changed, how it's responded to climate change, how management has changed the amount of carbon that's stored in it. So yeah, we basically have this sort of digital record. So come back to very highly accurate, and then we can sort of look at the trajectories change.
Are you able to show us how it actually works?
Sure. Yeah. So we have this very fancy screen on the back. When I started with these instruments, it did not look like this, and it was much more. But now they have these lovely user interfaces. So
They do humans.
it does everything. So it has a range of 400 meters. So if we scanned here, we're going to pick up all that greenhouse over there. We'll pick up all these trees on the horizon. Yeah.
Massive.
Yeah, completely. Well, it's an active remote sensing instrument, but it's completely eye safe. Yeah. We don't all have to duck and put our sunglasses on. So you can see there, so it will scan around. I think it will try and figure out where it is in space first. So it's got a GPS unit on the top here, and now it's scanning you. And if you come around the back here, you can see it building up the image of what it's scanning there. So it takes about 3 minutes. The darker grey is where either that light is being scattered, either by like a leaf, so it's a smaller target, or like our skin really absorbs that light. So yeah, that's why it looks dark. Our beards look pretty cool on
So what you're seeing on the screen is actually just a really small sample of what it's actually gathering. I think we're talking.
So this thing fires about 20, in that one scanner, it fired about 25 million laser pulses.
So what we're trying to do is teach the public something about the carbon cycle and what's going on with carbon in nature. So by kind of scanning that tree and working out how much carbon we've got in it, people can kind of equate and go, oh, that's being absorbed by CO2 going into the tree, actually being built out as biomass. And then that carbon will then go to the roots. Some of it will go into the roots and then to the soils and the fungi. So it's trying to teach about the whole carbon cycle and increase the understanding we have for what nature can provide us as humans, and hopefully ameliorate or get some of the problems we've got with climate change coming in. Trees will offer us a lot of cooling, but as well as offering that kind of carbon mass and storage.
This tree is an example of like incredible what can be done, like what could be done. In terms of the amount of carbon it's actually storing.
I think it's a huge amount, and as Phil said, in our ancient trees, our old trees, they're storing the most carbon. And that's one of the things we really need to think about is how do we look after those older trees? But then how do we get the next generation coming through so we have the older trees coming in? It's a particular problem in the UK is that we have actually quite old trees. Most of them are getting towards the end of their lives. We have very few middle-aged or younger trees coming through to actually replace them. You need to think a long time ahead, 200 years, to actually get these trees in place.
If you have enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would subscribe, rate, review, share the podcast with a friend. The more people we can get talking about the weather, the better. We want everyone to talk about the weather and love it as much as we do. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can just search for the Love of Weather. And we hope that you leave this episode loving the weather just that little bit more.
Thanks so much for listening. Bye.
Anymore.